Dr. Charlie Bamforth joins me this week to discuss haze and clarity in beer. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 142. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 142, and it's early February 2017. This week, Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the University of California, Davis, joins me to discuss haze and clarity in your beer. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now, only $19.99 for a year-long subscription or $17.99 for the digital edition. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. You can also read my column, Ask the Experts, there. Take advantage of their special deal now at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the Cornicle, a unique conical fermenter and kegging system that's all in one. The kegs feature a removable bottom, which makes cleanup a snap, and you can attach the unique conical bottom to the keg and use it as a pressure-capable fermenter. Ferment, keg, and serve all in one vessel with the Cornicle from Blickman Engineering. Find out more at blickmanengineering.com. And finally, for those fans of the podcast, a reminder that you can listen to all 142 episodes of the BeerSmith Podcast. They're streaming 24/7 on BeerSmith Radio at beersmith.com/radio. Stream it from your computer or mobile device anytime and catch up on back episodes. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Dr. Charlie Bamforth. He's professor of malting and brewing science at the University of California at Davis. Charlie specializes in the study of wholesomeness of beer, including beer perception, polyphenols, foam stability, oxidation, and flavor stability. Charlie, it is absolutely fantastic to have you back on the show.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
A great honor. I think this is your 8th time on the show. Can you believe that?
Oh my word. Oh dear. Can't you get anybody else?
Apparently not. No, I just love having you on the show. You're one of my favorite guests, so I'm very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So what have you been up to this past year or so? I think we had you on about a year ago.
Yeah, well, busy, still writing and still talking, probably too much.
Any new books out?
Yeah, there's the third in the quality series with the American Society of Brewing Chemists. That's going to appear in the next couple of months. It's called Freshness, and it's all about how to keep beer fresh and how to troubleshoot that and make sure you don't have stale beer. And I've been working on editing a book with a former student of mine by the name of Nick Bokolich, who did a lot of work on sour beers, and he's a microbiologist, so we've edited a book on the microbiology of beer, and hopefully that's going to come out during 2017 as well. And working on several other projects as well. And with a fair wind, I'm going to sign a new contract for a new book for Oxford University Press, which will, at the moment, we're working on the title In Praise of Beer. So I'm excited about that one as well.
That's awesome. I'm surprised you're taking on so many new projects, because I know you're getting ready to retire in a couple of years, right?
Yeah, that's probably the one thing that I'll continue doing quite a bit of, continue to write. I don't particularly want to stand in front of a classroom on campus anymore after 2018, but I'll still do some teaching and extension work and so on. But writing, I guess I'll continue that, and I'll continue to write about soccer, which really excites me as well.
Yeah, you told me you wanted to be a soccer goalie, right?
Yeah, I've probably grown out of that now. I don't think I'm going to make it. But
you could try out still.
I could do, yeah, actually. My team's playing Liverpool tomorrow, and the goalkeeper was suspended last week. He got sent off. But, I realized when they didn't call me and ask me, I realized that that's it. I'm probably not going to make it. But and the other thing we continue to do is, and this might interest your listeners, we continue to do 1 week classes. I do 4 every year, and 1 week classes. Get a lot of homebrewers participate in those, and brewers from larger companies as well, and other people from larger companies, people like places like sales and marketing, and we have a lot of fun. And if your listeners go to my webpage and click on short courses, they can there on the left hand side they can click on. I think it is, and then they'll come up to it. It's called Introduction to Practical Brewing, and
Yeah, and I'd be happy to put the link in the show notes as well, so folks can find it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Today you wanted to talk about beer, haze, and clarity. So let's start with a discussion about when and why clarity actually matters for the average beer brewer.
Yeah, it's a particularly salient topic at the moment because there's quite a bit of controversy in this area. For the longest time, for generations, it's been accepted and believed and established that beer should be bright. I mean, yeah, there are one or two beers that are less than bright, NQB, not quite bright. And of course, I'm particularly thinking about Hefeweizens, which, by their very nature are turbid, but hopefully not looking like chicken soup. Most people feel, however, that the majority of beers should be brilliantly clear because it's appealing. Mm-hmm. But I'm well aware of the fact that there is an alternative school of thought that there's a desire to have cloudy beers. It's very easy to think that perhaps that's because these people either haven't invested in a filter or aren't as convinced by received wisdom. And as I think I probably said on this show before, each to his or her own. Just because I believe something doesn't mean it's absolutely right. But personally, I believe that the majority of beers should be brilliantly bright, clear, and should remain so as well. We've done some work, Brad, on looking at this. We actually did a study a number of years ago, myself and a guy called Dylan Clark, mm-hmm. and we actually looked at a range of products of different degrees of turbidity, and without saying what we were looking at, just showing all these pairs of beers with different clarities, and asked people to pick out their preferred beer. At the end of the day, it was very clear that the ones that were least favored were the ones that were cloudy, and the ones that were favored were the ones that were bright and not cloudy. And when I'm talking cloudy, I'm not talking ridiculous amounts of cloudy. I was talking about beers that were ever so slightly hazy. Mm-hmm. So, I'll never forget when I first came over to Davis and I went into a bar in Sacramento, and this was a brew pub, and the beer, I mean, literally, it looked like chicken soup. And, I couldn't think of anything less appealing than that.
I understand, but yeah, obviously there's a trend in craft beer now. There's some craft breweries intentionally creating cloudy beers, right?
Yeah, there are. As I say, I try to be very even-handed about it all, and different people have got different opinions. To me, although I expect my Hefeweizen to be turbid, and my Cooper Sparkling Ale to be turbid, you think of most beer brands that are known and loved and respected from companies of all sizes, and the expectation is that they are bright, and at the very least they're not ridiculously turbid. So I've heard stories about people actually putting things like starch into beer to give a defined and controlled amount of nastiness, and
I think they sprinkle weed into it or something after it's finished, or some such thing.
Oh well,
yeah.
As they say, this too will pass, and it's all about a point of difference, isn't it? It's hey, we are different, and we are different because of this, and it's my belief, it's my feeling that it is not a smart way to go, but what do I know?
So let's talk about clarity, though. How do you actually go about measuring clarity or haze in a beer?
Well, there are two basic ways. One is instrumental, and one is literally what your eyes will tell you. And for most people, the easiest way is literally to have a bright source of light and hold the beer up against that light and take a look at it. When I was research manager of the Bass Brewing Company many years ago, we used to have a shelf and stood the beer on the shelf, and behind was a very bright light source. It was a strip of light, like a fluorescent light strip. And there was also a screen there which had a black line on it, a sharp black line. And what we used to do was to look at that black line through the beer. And the edges of the line were ever so sharp and very bright, very distinct, very tight. Then we knew the beer was brilliantly bright. If it was ever so slightly fuzzy, then we knew there was a turbidity issue here. When it comes to instruments, then for many, many years, people have used Haze meters. And traditionally, these have been devices. You put your beer in there. There's a light source which is shone into the beer, and you measure how much light is scattered at an angle of 90 degrees, right angles. And the more light you detect at 90 degrees, then the greater has been the degree of scatter. The problem with that is that you can have beers that look bright, they look clear, but they give a very high reading on a haze meter at 90 degrees. And this is something that we call invisible haze, which sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? I once tried to change the name to pseudo haze, but nobody liked that because they like to talk about having an invisible haze meter. And an invisible haze meter is one that measures the light scatter at a forward angle of scatter. It may be 13 degrees or it may be 25 degrees. And under those circumstances, you don't detect these invisible haze particles. These particles that cause this problem, the eye can't see them. But they do register on that 90-degree haze meter. And they can be due to various things. It may be unconverted malt, little particles from the endosperm. Some people have claimed that it's due to damage to yeast, and if you abuse yeast, and you can scrape bits off the surface, and that can cause this. So ultimately, it's what your eyes tell you. And if you do believe that 90-degree haze meter and say, hey, it's still cloudy, I'll refilter it. When you refilter, you can't remove these particles because they're too small to be taken out on the filter. So at the end of the day, you've got to trust what your eyes tell you. And for most brewers on most scales, the easiest thing to do is simply look at it.
Okay, well, let's move on to what the primary causes are for haze.
Well, there are many. There can be all sorts of things. First of all, they could be microorganisms. It could be yeast, or it could be other organisms, bacteria, for example, growing in the beer. And then we call that biological haze. Everything else is called non-biological haze, which is, I find it a silly term because, most of the materials are of biological origin, but could be various things. It could be beta-glucans from the cell walls or arabinoxylans, pentosands from the cell walls if you have a poorly modified malt, or if you're using certain adjuncts. For example, wheat will have high levels of these pentosands. It could be starch if you've not properly broken that down, if you've not been efficient in the brew house. It could be oxalate. Oxalate comes from the grain. And you need to take it out, otherwise it will throw a clarity problem in beer, but also even more so will block your dispense pipes, and that's called beer stone. It could be dead bacteria. We had this problem once in the UK, and these were bacteria that came from the malt, and they were dead because they'd been killed on the kiln and in the boiling stage. But they weren't being efficiently removed on the filter, and they were giving a dullness to the product. But the thing that most people talk about is proteins and polyphenols. And certainly they're very, very important. But everybody seems to focus on those, just the proteins and the polyphenols, forgetting that there's lots of other things that can cause turbidity. If you analyze a haze, you often find that it's not just protein and polyphenol. You often find there are other things on that haze particle as well. But it is true that the focus is on the proteins and the polyphenols.
Okay, and we'll be talking more about those in just a minute. I was wondering if you could explain what chill haze is and how that occurs.
Yeah, chill haze is haze that is not present at room temperature. Classically, we talk about 20 degrees centigrade, and as you know, I refuse to use the F word. If you chill it down to 0 degrees Celsius, if it goes turbid, that's chill haze. But if you warm it back up again to 20 degrees Celsius, it disappears. So that is chill haze. Permanent haze is haze that is there the whole time. And it is true to say that a major contributor to the permanent haze and developing into the permanent haze is chill haze. So there's a rule amongst brewers that if you prevent the chill haze, then that's going to go a long way to preventing permanent haze. And that's why cold is a key word in the process of getting stable beer.
So explain that to us. What causes the chill haze, and why does it actually?
What happens is, the model is a model from a good friend of mine by the name of Carl Siebert, and who for many years was the technical director of the Stroh Brewing Company, and for even longer, I think after that, was professor in Cornell. And what Carl did, he came up with a model showing the interaction between proteins and polyphenols. And there are two key elements to this. The first is these proteins are proteins that come from the grain, and they are very rich in an amino acid called proline. The second component was the polyphenols, but these polyphenols were two-ended. Without getting too complicated, you can have monomeric polyphenols, which is they're not simple molecules, but just one polyphenol. But if you oxidize them, they stick together. And I like to draw them out as two circles with a line in between them, a bit like a dumbbell. And if you've got a two-ended polyphenol, one side of it will stick onto a proline-rich site on one protein, and the other end of it will stick onto another protein and link them together. Now, the way I describe it is if you've got these proteins and polyphenols in beer at room temperature, these things are jigging around. They're not static. They're sort of whizzing about, if you like, in the beer. But when you chill it down, all of that movement slows down. So the polyphenols and the proteins, they've got a much better chance of sticking together and linking and giving this big, complicated complex, this mixture, which drops out of solution and gives you cloudiness. But then when you warm it up again, you reinvigorate these molecules and they whiz apart again, so the whole thing goes away. But over time, you get other types of bridges that occur between the proteins and the polyphenols, and the permanent haze is developed.
And I think you said at one time that oxygen plays a role in that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A very good point. Oxygen is key to this, because what oxygen does is when those polyphenols become oxidized, that it increases their tendency to link together. So when you oxidize a polyphenol, that happens, but also the color changes and it goes reddish or brown. So if you get oxidation, and I think we've talked about this before, in a brew house, if you get oxidation taking place, the first thing you'll see is a change of color. And that's why a lot of people making fairly lightly colored beers really don't want oxygen in the brew house, because you get a color pickup. But that oxidation also causes the polyphenols to bridge and become more complicated, and renders them in a form that they can bridge and give you haze.
So another very good reason to keep oxygen out of your beer, right?
Absolutely, very good reason. Actually, if you got oxidation in the brew house, in a mash, for example, that actually helps to remove protein and polyphenol. So there's less of it going through in the wort. So technically speaking, when it comes to haze stability, oxidation in the brew is a good thing, because it means less of these problematic proteins and less polyphenols going through into finished beer. But certainly oxidation downstream is bad news, not only for flavor stability, it's very bad news for haze stability as well.
Okay, well, let's dive into the proteins. You mentioned proteins, polyphenols. Let's dive into the proteins and talk about where those come from and how they get into the beer.
Yeah, they come from the grain, whatever grain you're going to use, really. But let's stick with malted barley. They're during malting, the storage proteins are partially broken down. Some of them are broken down as far as amino acids, and those are not a problem for haze. But some of the ones that are extracted and solubilized, they're still of a fairly large size. Then they are going to go forward and become haze-forming proteins. So if you think about and you measure how much of these proteins are present right the way through the process, they progressively go down. And that's what you can view malting and brewing as. They're an exercise in progressively getting rid of protein. So quite a lot of it happens during the malting process. Indeed, it is argued that the bulk of the protein breakdown occurs in the malt house and much less in the brew house. What happens in the brew house is protein precipitation. Now, the main stage at which you lose protein in the brew house is actually in sweet wort production, in mashing. There's a lot more protein precipitated out in mashing than is precipitated out in the boil. A lot of people are surprised by that, but that's a reality. But some is precipitated out when you boil as well. And it's the vigor of the boil that is extremely important. If you boil vigorously, you get more efficient precipitation. And not only that, the trube, the hop break, is better formed and is more easily settled out. And of course, you can encourage that settling out with things like Irish moss, carrageenan. You'll lose some protein during fermentation with the head, but then it's the cold stage, which is the next important stage, as well as techniques for removing protein downstream, different process aids.
I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned a lot of the proteins come out on the mash, is there anything you can do to enhance that process?
Well, oxidation is one of the things, but I'm not advocating it necessarily because.
So you're saying oxidize the mash, or?
Yeah, well, I'm not advocating that. Let me, please don't try this at home. But there was a researcher in Birmingham once, Dennis Briggs, who literally advocated adding hydrogen peroxide to a mash because that will promote the protein precipitation. No, I think you see. There is this two-word thing people talk about called a proteolytic rest, which is this mashing in at a lower temperature. And the argument is that this is an exercise in allowing greater breakdown of proteins. Now,
so what temperature would you do for that?
Well, we're talking 45, 50 degrees Celsius.
So pretty low, yeah.
It is. Now, there is a strong school of thought which argues that there is no proteolysis in a mash, that there is precipitation, but there is not protein digestion. There are other people who insist that there is protein digestion. That low temperature stand is probably more important for breaking down beta-glucans. So that's why I prefer to use the term glucanolytic rest. And now, of course, those glucans are a risk for haze and turbidity as well. So, either way, it's beneficial for haze stability. But it's arguable whether or not it is genuinely a proteolytic rest. Mm-hmm. So the one thing you would do either way is to make sure you have a good low temperature stand to eliminate whatever is being eliminated that is problematic. I think primarily it's beta-glucans, but then of course you do have to get the right conversion temperature to make sure you break down the starch, not only from the perspective of producing fermentable sugars, but also to make sure you don't have any residual starch left behind, because that too is going to be a haze risk. And the third thing in a mash is enough calcium. Because if you don't have enough calcium in the brew house, that is going to allow oxalate to get through into the finished beer, and that's going to be a clarity problem as well. And again, different people have got different ideas about how much calcium, but one rule of thumb that I have heard people preach is 80 parts per million, 80 milligrams per liter.
80, okay. Well, let's move on and talk about polyphenols and tannins, which of course are related.
Yeah, there are two sources of polyphenols. The first is the grain. and particularly the outer layers of the grain. So there are polyphenols in the husk of the grain, and to an extent these are going to be extracted into the mash, and even more so, the risk is during lautering. If you when you're collecting the wort, if you are greedy and you try to go to lower and lower specific gravities to get more and more extract out, unless you are mindful of the pH, it is going to rise. And at the end of lautering, in the weak worts, you're going to pull out more tannins, more polyphenols. And that's going to have an effect on flavor in terms of astringency, but it's also going to have an effect on the stability, the risk of haze. So it's a good idea to, particularly if you've got water that's fairly alkaline, it is a good idea to make sure you have enough calcium there to hold the pH down. Now,
that would be calcium in your sparge water, I assume, right?
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, it is also entirely possible to get malt that does not contain the problematic polyphenols. This is called low proanthocyanidin malt. People who study polyphenols use all sorts of ridiculous terms, but it's called low proanthocyanidin malt. And this malt does not contain those problematic polyphenols. So these are available. So you can actually buy malts that are going to reduce the haze risk. You've also got to remember, however, that polyphenols come in hops. Mm-hmm. And the more hop material you put in, the higher the polyphenol level will be. Excuse me, I got an itchy nose, but there you go. I'll just rub it. There we go.
So I mean, if you're making an IPA or a super IPA, where you're putting like some ridiculous number of IPUs in, I assume that's a risk, right?
It is. And the other thing is, if you say you're using an aroma hop, which has got a relatively low alpha, and to get a high bitterness with a low alpha hop, you've got to put lots and lots of hop material in there. Remember that you're putting in a lot of polyphenol. And that's why it really does make sense if you're making a very bitter beer. You're making an IPA with a very strong dry hop character. It makes eminent sense to use a bittering hop in the kettle, but to restrict the aroma hop to the dry hopping at the end. Hop extracts do not contain polyphenols. So if you really want to take the sort of the I'm not going to put polyphenols in strategy, then that will be a combination of low proanthocyanidin malt together with hop extract. Now there is, the world of brewing is, as you know, is full of opinions, and what I like to say to the students, as long as you remember mine are the correct ones, we're okay. And I'm teasing when I say that, but there are people who firmly believe that if you do take that low polyphenol strategy, then that detracts from beer quality. And beers that do not contain polyphenols, they would argue, maybe lack a degree of body, they're soulless. Whether that's true or not, I've not made that study myself, but I personally am not a big fan of hop extracts, but are you talking about both CO2 extract and the isomerized ones? Yes. So both. When you extract, you're not extracting the polyphenols. So if you're using post-fermentation bittering, the isomerized extracts or the reduced iso extracts, they're not providing any polyphenol at all. But as I say, my personal prejudice, for want of a better word, is against hop extracts. I'm not a big fan, but I personally share my friend Ken Grossman's opinion that if you do anything to a hop, you detract from it, and which is why whole cone hops really are best.
Well, when we talk about selecting malts, what can you do to minimize the proteins and tannins that you're going to get in your finished beer? You talked a little bit about it.
Well, yeah, the most extreme is the use of the low proanthocyanidin malts.
But I mean, each malt has a protein content, right?
Yes, it does. And the lower the protein, obviously, the less the haze risk. You've also got to be mindful of the protein modification in the grain. Has it got the appropriate, some people call it the Kohlbach index or the S over T ratio, the soluble nitrogen ratio, should be in the mid 40s, 45 or so percent. And remember that the more protein you put into the grist, the bigger the risk. So if you're using 100% malt, you've got a bigger risk than if you're using 70% malt and 30% corn or rice, because they are providing less protein in the first place. The other thing that you're going to have, and this is going to be dependent upon the grist you choose, you're going to have other things that are clarity problems. So if you use wheat in your grist, you've got to be mindful of the fact that the pentosands, the arabinoxylans, are going to be a bigger problem. It is a case that the golden rule is the less protein is present in the grist, the greater is the avoidance, should we say, of a haze risk. But you wouldn't make your grist selection really, I think, Brad, on that basis. You first and foremost would choose your grist based on what do you want to make, and then make sure you have darn good processing to make sure you're going to minimize the colloidal, the haze risk.
Makes sense. And then isn't this also related to foam retention?
Protein, yeah, well...
well, and polyphenols, right? Polyphenols, I think, play a role.
No,
they don't? Okay.
Polyphenols and foam is a complete myth. I've dedicated a long time to looking at foam. The claims that are made for polyphenols and foam, I think, are very weak. And usually it is people have drawn correlations. They've taken a range of beers and they've measured all sorts of things, including the foam stability, and they've correlated one thing with another. And they say, hey, look, the beers with the more polyphenol in are the ones that have the best foam. But remember, the beers with the more polyphenol in them are usually going to be the ones that got more protein and the ones that got more bitterness, because the hops and the malt are providing polyphenols as well as the foam, as well as
but we have talked about that hops do play a role in foam retention, right?
It's the bitterness. It's the isoalpha acids.
Right, it's the iso.
Foam stabilizes. It's nothing to do with polyphenols. So,
but going back quickly to proteins, though, proteins do play a role in foam retention, certainly.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And there is a point of difference here. There probably is some overlap, but the haze forming proteins are these ones that are rich in proline. And the foam ones are the more hydrophobic ones, and two key ones are lipid transfer protein, LTP1, and a protein called protein Z. And they are much more important to foam than they are to haze. So there is a point of difference with the proteins. The other thing to say in passing is those proline-rich proteins are also the ones that people with gluten intolerance and celiac disease, those are the ones that they are sensitive to. And there is a downstream or a fermentation process you can apply that gets rid specifically of those problematic proteins, problematic for health, problematic for haze, without damaging the foam.
And I think there's some companies now selling enzymes as well that break them down even post. Yeah,
that is exactly what I'm referring to.
Okay, so I know White Labs, I think, has one, Clarity Firm or something like that. I know there's other ones.
They do. Probably the biggest seller is Brewers Clarex from the DSM company, and that is an enzyme called prolyl endoproteinase. So the name says it all. Prolyl means that what it reacts with, what it breaks down, are those linkages that contain proline, which, as I've said, are the ones that are present in the haze-forming proteins. So it specifically breaks those down and does not break down the proteins that are responsible for foam.
So, I mean, that's a great way if you're gluten intolerant to make a gluten-reduced beer or almost gluten-free beer, right?
Totally gluten-free beer. Probably the best known brand is Omission from Craft Beer Alliance. There are others as well. We at Davis, we've helped people develop beers in this way. It's one thing you can do at UC Davis. You can come and pay us modest sums of money, and we'll help you devise a new beer. Yeah, and the beauty of it, frankly, Brad, is that you can actually make beers that taste like the beers you're used to. If you use other raw materials, you can make perfectly good products, but they don't have the same flavors as those that are made from, say, malted barley.
Right. The enzymes don't actually change the flavor much at all, if at all, right?
Not at all, in our experience. No.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, are the polyphenols in the hops actually different from the polyphenols that you get from the malt?
If they are, it's very subtle. Again, if you delve into the literature, the first thing you'll find out is that polyphenol chemistry is ridiculously complicated, and they don't make it any easier by the crazy terminology they use. But I think at the end of the day, the polyphenols that are responsible for turbidity in beer are the same, whether they come from hops or indeed from malt.
Okay. Well, let's step back for a moment and talk about what practical steps the average homebrewer might be able to take to reduce haze in their beer.
Well, first of all, attention in the grist selection, as I've said. But the second one is to make sure that you do have your good practices in the hot work production, and one of the things that is an obvious one is that good, vigorous boil. I've talk about that all the time. The vigorous rolling boil, making sure you get good coagulation and good settling, which will be assisted by carrageenan. Then after cooling and fermentation, then we come to a key stage. And that is, of course, the cold stage, and I think we'll talk about that in a minute. The thing I say to my students is, the severity, the attention really depends very much on how long you want your beer to be on the shelf. If you're brewing in a brew pub and you're selling the beer from a tank, then I think, as I've said, I believe it should be bright, but the lifetime of that beer is not going to be expected to be very, very long. If, however, you are intent on conquering the world with your beer and you're going to put it on a ship and send it thousands of miles across an ocean, then you've got to be much more robust about what you do. And under those circumstances, you're going to want to be using some processes downstream to make sure that you remove the worst of the protein and polyphenol that is remaining. And of course, on any scale, filtration or centrifugation are key ways for removing insoluble material and rendering a product bright. You got to remember, we've got to differentiate between the product as it's first produced and product over time. So product as first produced, that's about good processing, but it's also about clarifying at the end of the day. Now, that could be involving fining materials. And as soon as you start using fining materials like isinglass, it does get complicated and a challenge. And a lot of people don't want to go there. But what do we have in our brewery here at Davis? We have a simple sheet filter, and we're about to take receipt of a cross-flow filter. And of course, still a lot of people on different scales insist on the benefits of powder filtration with diatomaceous earth, or not quite so good, perlite. But then, of course, having got bright beer, sooner or later it's going to go turbid. Because the haze form materials are going to be coming out of solution, proteins, polyphenols, and other things as well. So again, it depends on how long you want your beer to remain bright.
Makes sense. I want to step back for just 1 second. I skipped over this, but we didn't talk about mash pH and the role it plays in clarity.
controlling mash pH is an important thing generally for controlling enzymic reactions. The other influences of pH in a mash are going to be more relevant. So what I mean by that is there is a justification for lowering the pH in a mash down to around 5.1. But that's not so much due to for haze reasons, but that is for stability reasons. At those low pHs, you are going to prevent the action of an enzyme called lipoxygenase. And lipoxygenase oxidizes fatty acids, as long as it's got some oxygen there. And we have shown that those oxidized fatty acids are damaging for foam. Some people believe also that is the problem for flavor stability as well. So if you lower the pH, you should get better foam stability, and some people would argue better flavor stability as well. In terms of the influence on haze stability, it's probably not a major thing. The importance of pH in wort production, as I've said already, is much more to do with the extraction of polyphenols during wort separation, during lautering.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I've noticed if you get the pH down low, you mentioned 5.1, 5.2, particularly for lighter lagers and things like that, they tend to, the flavor's a lot brighter on the beer.
Yeah, and I think it's probably related to what I was describing for the most part.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you wanted to cold crash beer is one great way to improve the clarity of it. Can you talk about what's going on when we actually cold crash our beer?
Yeah. Well, what you're basically doing is inducing chill haze, and the golden rule is the lower the temperature, the better, without freezing. If you freeze beer, if you've ever frozen beer and you've thawed it out again, you've seen you really do get a lot of junk comes out. So, but you've got other problems. Then you've got
maybe like Eisbach is what I'm thinking of there. But
yeah, something like that. And you really got integrity problems as well with the package unless you're very careful. So the golden rule is as low as possible without freezing it. Now, beer will not freeze at 0 degrees Celsius because the alcohol lowers the freezing point. The more alcohol you've got, the lower the freezing point. People talk about high gravity brewing. One of the advantages of high gravity brewing is more stable beer, because with a high gravity brew, you can easily go to -2 or possibly even lower, and then you pull stuff out of solution. Stuff chills out that doesn't even chill out at 0. I did a lot of work with a student from Germany called, she's actually Austrian, Michaela Miedl, and what we showed was that basically -1 for 2 days is far better than +1 for 2 months, in that it's the temperature that matters much more than the time. So the challenge is how to do that and how to get all of your beer down to that very low temperature evenly. Now, I'm no mechanic, no engineer, so I don't want to answer questions like that, but all I do know is that it works. And then you need to keep it at that low temperature all the way onto the filter, because if it warms up again, it's going to go back into solution. Now, people say, expensive, and the answer is yeah. And so they say, well, if I use some of these downstream treatments to remove protein or polyphenol, do I need to go to such a low temperature? And what I always say is, well, suck it and see. It's up to you to work out. If you use silica gels or enzymes or tannic acid for removing protein, or if you remove polyphenols with PVPP, maybe you don't need to get to such a low temperature. And again, if you're brewing in a bucket and or in a slightly bigger vessel, and you're going to sell the product within a week or so, how big a deal is it? The beauty of the cold, of course, is that your beer is never going to be more resistant, never more stable than when it's sitting there at say -1, because it's slowing all the chemistry down. The beer is it's not going to deteriorate. And you can buy yourself some time. You can breathe a while the beer is sitting at -1. But again, expensive.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk finally about the various finings, and I know we talked about Irish moss or carrageenan, very important during the boil, but let's talk about some of the different finings you can use after fermentation's done and what they affect and how they work.
Well, the main one, of course, is isinglass, and being an Englishman originally, it's close to my heart. Isinglass is a protein. It's collagen, which comes from the swim bladders from fish from the South China Seas and sturgeon family. And inside a fish, there's a swim bladder, and this is a device whereby the fish either fills it full of gas or excludes the gas, depending on how high it wants to float. It's a side product from the food industry, and somebody sometime found that if you dissolve the swim bladder, which you can do with dilute acid, then you produce a protein solution which is positively charged, got a net positive charge at beer pHs, and it will stick onto the negative charge of the yeast and agglomerate the yeast, and it will settle out. So this is the basis of clarification of English cask ales, traditional English cask ales. In my company in the UK, we used to also put it into the cold tank. There's two things happen in a cold tank, cold conditioning. The first is chilling out the protein, like I've described, the chill haze. The second is letting it settle. And if you put in isinglass finings, they basically make the complex bigger. So now it will tend to sink and sink to the bottom of the vessel. So isinglass is very effective. Very much an art in that, every season would come round and we'd have to work out how many pints per barrel of isinglass we would need to add to effectively clarify the product. And then we worried about things like fluffy bottoms, because if you want to know what a fluffy bottom is, that's when you've got your nice settled out thing at the bottom of the barrel, and suddenly it will go poof, and you'll get this strand of insoluble material sort of rise and start floating in the product because they were nice and fluffy. So it's all about settleability as well. That's very much about the yeast. But you can also use auxiliary finings. Some of these are alginates that come from seaweed. Some of them are silicates, and these are negatively charged. So the isinglass is positively charged, and the silicates or the alginates are negatively charged. And so with judicious use of both of them, you are going to be precipitating out, alternatively, negative or positive materials. Probably more relevant for the stability of them. So those are very relevant for the clarity, initial clarity of the product. In terms of the stability, then, like I briefly mentioned earlier on, you can either remove residual protein or you can remove polyphenol. Polyphenol, you can do it with PVPP, and the beauty of that is you can actually regenerate the PVPP with sodium hydroxide. Proteins, silica gels, they can be used. Also tannic acid, which comes from gall nuts, and you'd put that into the cold tank, and that will give you a lot of protein precipitation. The trouble is that it tends to make that beer more difficult to filter. So a newer idea is to actually dose it in as the beer approaches the filter. And the third is enzymes. The Wallerstein Corporation, over 100 years ago, advocated papain, which comes from papaya. It's the enzyme you get in meat tenderizer.
That's used a lot in wines, I believe, too, right?
Yeah, it's very good at removing Haze proteins, but it's also very good at removing foaming proteins. It's not discriminatory. So I really don't recommend using papain. But that's where prolyl endoproteinase comes in, Clarex, because you put that in the fermenter, and that selectively removes the Haze forming proteins and the gluten type proteins that people are sensitive to without damaging the foam. But like I say to all of my students, you shouldn't think that by using these things, it absolves you from getting it right upstream. You've got to get it right all the way through, because all the Clarex in the world and all the PVPP in the world is not going to sort out a beta-glucan problem or a starch problem.
Right.
So you've got to do you got to be mindful of good practice from start to finish.
So, I mean, some of the ones I know that are available to homebrewers, I just wrote down, PVPP is certainly widely available. Isinglass is widely available. We've seen a lot of rise of these silicas now being used. And there's even two-stage ones. I think Superclar or something like that is like a two-stage. You put in a positive, and then like 24 hours later, you put in the negatively charged one or something like that.
Correct.
What about gelatin? I know a lot of us just use unflavored gelatin.
I have no personal experience of using it, but compared with isinglass, I would doubt it's as effective. Isinglass, as I said, it's a soluble collagen, but there's something about it that makes it really effective. Whereas other forms of collagen are not as good. I remember people have experimented with things from cowhide, for example, and so on. And there's some degree of performance, but not as good as isinglass. And it really is. It's not exactly snake oil, but there's something about isinglass which has not been completely worked out about how it is so effective. And of course, there are those that are reluctant to use it because it is an addition. And perhaps that cues another story that perhaps I could just tell you, that one of the other things you've got to be mindful of is putting things into the process stream and the product that don't like one another. There's a famous instance in this country, and that, of course, was Schlitz. And Schlitz, back in the 70s, had a terrible problem with clarity. And these were bits. The beer contained, it was like a child's snowstorm. One of these little toys that you turn upside down and you get snows coming down. That's what Schlitz looked like. And it was because they were putting a colloidal stabilizer, a Haze stabilizer, and a foam stabilizer into the product. And these two things reacted together and gave you bits. At Bass, I think I can tell you this story. We had an alcohol-free beer called Barbican, and we used to, literally alcohol-free, less than 0.05%. Mm-hmm. And we used to sell it to Saudi Arabia. And I don't know how we got this alcohol-free beer into Saudi Arabia, but we did. And it would go in and sit on the dockside in Saudi, and it was 50 degrees Celsius.
Oh my goodness!
It was, and the beer was sitting there, and it developed this it was like frog spawn on the bottom of the bottle, and it settling a precipitate in the bottom of the bottle. And when we analyzed it, we found it was isinglass sticking on to the foam stabilizer that we were using. A foam stabilizer, something called PGA, and these two things just didn't like one another, and so they were sticking together and settling out. And the agitation on the ship going from the UK to Saudi had exacerbated the situation. So, we took away the foam stabilizer. I guess some people would have taken away the isinglass, but we took away the foam stabilizer and the problem went away. So the moral of that story is don't abuse the beer, in other words, by transportation and heat, but also be very careful of what you are using in your beer. And I guess that would be a good argument for, let's not use any process aids, but yeah. You've got to be mindful.
Well, Charlie, I was just wondering if there's anything you wanted to add at the end or mention anything else that you might be working on.
No, we are busy working on stuff. And I'll tell you, I've got my last ever master's student. I've given her the task of proving me right or wrong, because I've, for the longest time, insisted that at the end of fermentation, when you have finished sorting out the VDKs, the diacetyl, pentane, and so on, once you've done that, I don't believe there's any advantage to storing beer any longer than that. And we're using a technique called metabolomics to see whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong. So she's kind of nervous. Her name's Laura Matrulis.
So how short are we talking about?
Well, I believe that you don't need to have any length of storage after the VDK arrest in these days. The days of needing prolonged lagering, I think, are long gone. So I won't name the name, but I used to have a degree of responsibility for a famous lager in the UK, and we dealt with the VDKs during fermentation. Once the total vicinal diketone level had gone down to below our specification, then we would get the yeast away from there as fast as possible with a centrifuge, chill it down to -1 for 3 days, and then get it filtered and packaged, arguing that the sooner we got the package back, the sooner we could fill it up again. And if your listeners know anything about the UK beer market, it remains the biggest selling brand of beer in the UK. So, and it's a lager. Nice. So there is no, in my opinion, well, that proves the case. You could argue whether you like that beer or not, but the total turnaround time, production time for that beer is not ridiculous lengths of time. So Laura Matrulis will show me if there is something I'm missing there, and I will bow out gracefully whichever way it is.
Well, hopefully we can get you back soon to talk about that. Love to have you on the show.
I hope so. So remind me what I told you, and I'll tell you whether Laura went away smiling or not, depending on whether she wants to prove me right or wrong.
I will make a note of that.
All right.
Thank you, Charlie. Really appreciate you being on the show today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
It is always an honor to have Dr. Charlie Bamforth with us. He is a professor of malting and brewing science at the University of California at Davis. Charlie is the author of many books on fermentation, beer quality, and beer. Thanks, Charlie.
Pleasure.
A big thank you to Dr. Charlie Bamforth for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get a 1-year subscription now for only $19.99 from beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the Cornicle combined fermentation and kegging system. Ferment in a keg with a conical bottom attached, and then just swap the bottom out, carbonate, and serve from the same keg. Find out more about the Cornicle at blickmanengineering.com. And finally, I'll mention the BeerSmith newsletter. When you sign up, I'll send you a short article on homebrewing every single week. It's free, and all you need to do is go to beersmith.com and enter your name and email in the newsletter box at the right sidebar. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.